Hi there, and welcome to the final panel of the day. Thank you to all of you for holding out with us, and we're waiting on one last panelist, but we're going to go ahead and get started. In lieu of the traditional introduction, since you have that all in your program for today, what I really want to say to today's panelists is welcome back. First of all, to Catherine Bradshaw, who was here at Hopkins for a long time and is now a professor and associate dean for research at the University of Virginia. It's great to have you back here. Secondly, to Julia Burdick-Will, who's been out on leave and sabbatical for a year and is re-entering her work here at the School of Education and the School of Arts and Sciences. So thank you for coming. And then we'll be joined in a few minutes by Dr. Sonja Santelises, CEO of the Baltimore City Public Schools, who we are very happy to have back in Baltimore working with us. The final panel today is on creating a school environment for success. We're going to have each of our panelists speak for about 10 to 12 minutes, and just like we've been doing throughout the whole day, there are going to be various ways that you can ask questions through tweeting, through emailing your questions in, or there'll be folks in both of the aisles with index cards that you can write questions on, and they'll be brought up to me. So I think without further ado, we'll just go ahead and start with Dr. Catherine Bradshaw.
I put us in there. And I'm that one. Thank you. Well, thank you very much for inviting me here. I had been at Hopkins as a faculty member in our School of Public Health for about 9 years, and then I decided about 4 years ago that I'd take on a second job at the University of Virginia. So I actually still do some work here in Baltimore and have an appointment in our School of Public Health, and I'm pleased to oversee the school-based prevention work through our Youth Violence Prevention Center that's directed by Phil Leaf, who's also involved with the Urban Health Institute. So you'll hear a lot about Maryland and Baltimore today as I reflect on some of the research that we have going on. But when I moved from the School of Public Health as a developmental psychologist, a couple of my colleagues said, you know, it's probably good, given all the amount of work you do in schools, for you to go work in a school of ed and try to figure out about how we prepare teachers and educators for working in school settings, and particularly in urban settings, and how we approach issues around school safety and climate and youth engagement. So it's been a great education for me, as well as hopefully for some of our interdisciplinary team as we think about a program of research that's focused on improving youth through improving school climate. So that's a little bit of a backdrop on who I am. But I really wanted to talk a little bit about school climate today. And school climate has many different definitions. In fact, Bob Blum's done a lot of work in this area and was one of the early people that got me interested in aspects about it. But one of which is a focus on norms and thinking about what are kind of acceptable behaviors in an environment. What are values that we might have, like high aspirations for high school completion, expectations for student engagement and achievement. But this all translates into youth as well as adults feeling supported and socially safe, feeling emotionally safe and physically safe. And you'll hear me talk a lot about not just kids that work in schools and learn in schools, but the adults that are working with them. Because if we aren't providing that base level of support and need, there's no way that our kids can be successful. And certainly if our staff aren't feeling supported in a school environment and emotionally safe, they're not going to put themselves out there to be able to help kids. How many of you remember from school at any point this Maslow hierarchy of needs? This is always a fun little refresher, because then you feel really smart because you're like, wow, I went to school all those years and I actually learned something that's relevant to what I do now. I actually think a lot of this hierarchy of needs stuff is very relevant to when we think about schools and school climate, because if you don't have those basic sense of safety and psychological needs, there's no way you can be actualized or self-actualized. And what does that mean in a school setting? Well, often it means doing well and being successful in school and graduating and high school completion, for example. But we could think a lot about your sense of belonging or connectedness, which is really right in the middle of that pyramid. If you don't have a basic sense of safety, it's going to be very difficult for you to feel like you're part of that community and supported by others. And those are all things that are needed for youth to feel a sense of esteem and accomplishment of the work that they're doing and feel self-actualized, depending on what that looks like. But when we think about climate, is the climate a consequence or actually a cause of behavior? And that might sound kind of basic, but for example, if a kid sees that there's a lot of fighting going on in the school environment, they're probably going to think the environment isn't very safe and supportive. And if you're not feeling very safe, you're probably feeling that you've got to be on your guard and watch out for things that happen. I do a lot of work in the bullying area, for example, and that's one area where we see that kids that don't feel safe and feel like they're bullied, they look around and they say, you know, all these teachers are watching me get bullied, but they're not doing anything to help me out. And so in many cases, that makes them feel less safe and less supported in that environment. So I tend to think about the behavior and the environment really being related very tightly to each other. So it's tough for us to tease apart the behavioral aspects of an environment relative to the perceptual indicators. And there's been a lot of interest in school climate. In fact, the recent passing of the Every Student Succeeds Act, this is the new term for No Child Left Behind, very positively oriented in terms of the language here. Here's former President Obama signing it into legislation. And there's in fact a strong element of that that focuses on the other side of the report card, not just caring about what students are doing academically, but what they're doing, some even call them non-cognitive skills. What are they doing socially, emotionally? And how do we foster learning environments that are supportive of those non-cognitive skills? But we all have a different perspective on issues in an environment. Quite often when we go in and look at school climate surveys, for example, we ask questions of the students as well as the staff, sometimes of the parents and the leadership in the building, and more times out of not, we find that they don't actually agree very well. So that's why it's so important for us to be able to assess multiple perspectives on issues of school climate as well as safety. But what we do see is that those attitudes and perceptions are very real to their consequences. So even if you're perceiving the environment not to be very safe and supportive, you're going to act on those perceptions. So the perceptual data is very important. So let's think a little bit about our perceptions of Baltimore. When I go around the country and sometimes out of this country and talk a little bit about the work that we do in Baltimore, I tend to bring up this slide, because this is what a lot of people from the outside think about Baltimore. But this is what we see from the inside and what many of our kids are experiencing. They're walking around in areas that are unsafe and unsupportive, and many kids call this home, with burnt-out buildings and cars and buses driving by for a lot of our challenged youth. These slides come from my colleague Phil Leaf, who really is very connected to the work that the Urban Health Institute is doing and has helped us think much more about the work that's happening outside the schools and how it's impacting the schools. And it's not just impacting the kids, it's impacting the adults. In fact, we see in a lot of our schools in the city and surrounding areas, issues of teacher turnover are very, very challenging. Some of these schools can't even get substitute teachers to come in when teachers are absent. And these issues around safety impact not only the youth as well as the parents. And so we could think a little bit more about what's happening within the community and issues around violence. This is certainly not new information to many of you, but perhaps you haven't been thinking as much about how issues in the community impact the schoolhouse. And while we certainly want to create that safe harbor within a school, it's very difficult for us to build on that base of a pyramid like Maslow's without that sense of safety and support and the psychological and emotional and physical needs that kids are having. In fact, 60% of the school shootings happen within community-based shootings happen within an eighth of a mile of schools. And so that's having a significant impact when we think about levels of trauma that are occurring. And so these kind of stressors can get under the skin. They can impact brain development, issues around genetics. In fact, there's even emerging research showing that certain genes can turn on or turn off based on certain experiences in the community. And some of those genes can actually impact kids' responsiveness to different kinds of interventions. We can also think about the accumulation of adverse childhood events that occur and experiences, and how that addition of multiple traumas can really add up to negatively impact youth. And then there's a fancy term called allostatic load. This is essentially your experience of stress and how your body doesn't bounce back after every single stressor. In fact, your body can even take a toll, and your brain can take a toll based on history of repeated exposure to trauma. This is a slice of a brain from a youth. There are two different kids that are represented here. And this just shows you, even without necessarily having to have formal training, you can see that the brains of these two children are different. The one on the right there being a child that was extremely neglected as compared to a normal, typically developing child. And so the impacts of stress on the brain and the body can be very vast. They can impact the way kids process interactions with others and the way that they influence their behavior in a way that certainly compromises their ability to perform academically. But also a lot of their social decisions can be negatively impacted by these kinds of stressors. And the way that they respond to future stress. Some kids become hypervigilant to certain kinds of threats. Others really downregulate and pull back away. And it's difficult for us to be able to detect some of the symptoms of those kids that withdraw and pull away from others within the community. We also need to be thinking about how these kinds of exposure to stress can influence their sense of gratification or persistence in the face of a challenge. And sadly, schools sometimes put in place certain kinds of policies or practices that don't actually help us. Fortunately, the field is now recognizing how issues around suspension and punishment and office referrals really don't serve as an intervention. While they may seem like they're providing some temporary solution of removal for a kid that's in distress, they are not therapeutic interventions. And much like zero tolerance, we're finding that they're disproportionately used with students of color and are actually doing more harm than good. So we need to be very careful that we monitor the impact of our policies and practices to ensure that they're not doing more harm to our kids. And what can we do to improve this? Well, schools in many ways can act as a buffer. They can be a supportive environment, not only to build that hierarchy of needs and support and that foundation for it, but they serve as an important ecological context. We need to be thinking about how we're supporting our staff that are responding and helping kids. Also thinking more about trauma-informed approaches and tiered interventions. So I want to give you a snapshot on some of these kinds of approaches that are being used, not only here in urban districts like Baltimore City, but around the state and in other communities. One such approach is called positive behavioral interventions and supports, which helps build a system of support to aid students that are in need of assistance. It really starts at that foundational level with the universal Tier 1 aims to be able to build a school-wide sense of climate and connectedness, and then helps build in systems and practices to be able to meet the needs of other kids. There's a strong emphasis on data, like the collection of school climate data, and putting in place certain practices or programs that might be able to meet the needs of students, as well as developing certain routines or systems that are able to create a more predictable environment. So what does this look like? These are some snapshots from some schools that we've been working with here in Baltimore City, where you can see that kids are reinforced for positive behavior and engage in activities that help improve a school climate. But there are going to be kids that need additional support, and not just in the form of ice cream. But the ice cream serves as a nice little parallel about thinking about levels of support. So if we think about a lot of people like vanilla ice cream, very, very plain, and that tends to be something that is fairly generic and a lot of people respond to. However, you could think about Tier 2 supports, adding a little special sauce on there. This is just like in a school where you have Tier 1 kinds of supports that benefit all students in the building, but then you add something a little bit special, a little bit additional to meet the needs of kids that need a Tier 2 support. And then there are kids that need highly specialized supports, and these are kids that might benefit from a trauma-informed approach or need therapeutic services that are provided through the community. And while this sense of ice cream is kind of a little bit vague on some level, it's something that I find that people usually stick with. When they walk away from talks like this, they always think, well, remember thinking about that ice cream example about kids I'm working with. Do they need a little bit of special sauce? How much specialized support do they need? Rather than thinking about the complex terminology we often use in public health of universal, selective, or indicated. It's really just about layers and tiers of support. But as we move up and get more specialized in the support services we provide for students, we need more resources, we need more training, we need better data, we need more intensive kind of support and elements that are going to be complexly brought together. And so there's a way that you can think about organizing and coordinating those kinds of supports in schools. And so that way you're able to address issues around social emotional learning and bullying prevention and truancy, going all the way up to specialized services like school mental health. We also find that certain practices like restorative practices are a really nice bridge because they provide an opportunity to create a positive school and learning environment in the classroom and try to prevent problems before they occur, but also provide a potential solution and strategy to use when there are conflicts that arise. This is a model of social-emotional learning that's very consistent with this approach, where we think about not only are we teaching kids math and science, but we also want to teach kids about self-management and being self-aware, how to make good decisions and how to build relationships and how to be socially aware. This is a particular model of social-emotional learning that's very complementary with this type of approach. And recently, this is a slide of a news article that appeared in the Baltimore Sun that showcased one of the models that the School of Public Health has been investing in for a number of years, called the good behavior game. We have over 2 decades of studies showing now long-term impacts of using some of these practices in kindergarten and first grade. This particular model, the good behavior game, has been well researched and tested by faculty here in the school and has actually been broadly disseminated, not just across Baltimore City, but other schools around the area. I'd encourage you to check out this Sun article because it features a lot of video footage and interviews with principals and teachers that have shown success using this particular model. And there's been other efforts to scale up not only positive behavior support, but the integrated framework behind it. And we're marshaling data from the state showing that these impacts are actually having a change. Over multiple years of implementation of positive behavior support, we're seeing reductions in suspensions as well as improvements in academic performance for students. And I'll end with just one snapshot of a particular project we have going on that came at the result of a request from Baltimore City. This was shortly following the shootings and uprising that occurred around the death of Freddie Gray. We were approached by Baltimore City about partnering with them on a grant to the National Institute of Justice to weave together supports in high schools, thinking about mental health prevention and promotion, working with city school police and closed-circuit TV to be able to provide data in the hands of school police as well as school community members and students to make better decisions about improving school climate. We call this project Coping Power in the City because it builds off of research around a program called Coping Power that had been already shown to be successful in elementary and middle schools in Baltimore City, but we wanted to expand it up to the high school level. And this is certainly something that takes a broad set of partnerships. So not only are we working with city schools, as well as the city school police and university partners, but Shepherd Pratt, mental health provider, has been a key partner in this particular effort. So I just wanted to wrap up with a couple of lessons, and these are really just a couple of taglines to think about. Remember that ice cream model? We really want to think about what we're doing school-wide to help all students, so that way we can be able to promote issues around school climate and address behavior more directly. We want to think about data, like school climate data, to be able to improve the environment. We want to communicate not only the data, but other efforts and good news that are happening, like we saw from the Sun article. Thinking more about integration, so that way we don't have too many different programs and practices that are disconnected. Youth voice, obviously that's been a strong commitment to the Urban Health Institute, and the examples that we're hearing today about youth voice are critical to the success of any initiative. Implementation science is our fancy way of talking about how we make sure that we're doing what we think we're doing and we're providing the supports needed to do that well. And this might come in the form of coaching and other kinds of specialists that go into the classroom and help teachers actually improve the work that they're doing. And ultimately, this comes back to a strong leadership team, and that could be supported and certainly needs to be supported by a principal as well as the district leadership. So with that, I think I will pass it off to our next speaker.
Great. Thank you so much. So Dr. Santelises, you're up next, and I just want to welcome you here. And I started by welcoming you back to Baltimore. It's great to have you both in the city, taking on this job and here today.
Great. Thank you. Great. Well, thank you all. And it is great to be here with you today. It's actually great to have part of my day to talk about students and not budgets or legislation or any of those other things that it seems as if I'm spending a great deal of my time doing these days. And the great part about this panel is it really does represent the core of the work that we have in front of us in Baltimore City Public Schools. So I will give 10 or 12 minutes, and I do want to thank my colleagues, particularly Catherine, for going first, and I appreciate that. I did not intend to be late, but I'm glad that I am with you today. And so what I'll do is just share a bit of how we are approaching the work in city schools. And I think it's important, and a number of these points I think Catherine touched on in very practical ways, that it's important to locate them within a larger frame within Baltimore City and Baltimore City Public Schools in terms of directionally where we're going in terms of school environment that actually meets the needs of our young people. So first, I think it's important for you all to understand that there's a real shift that we are engaged in within the district from a real kind of discipline-first approach to school climate to one that is a healthy school climate. And part of that, and that's kind of easy to say in a quick soundbite, but I can't overemphasize the real culture shift that reflects. And part of that is because upon re-entering city schools, one of the things that I realized was first that a lot of the work that the city schools had actually been nationally recognized for with regards to reduced suspensions, with regards to a lot of the kind of proactive work to reduce harsh discipline really had, it was like any garden that you don't tend. You've got a beautiful garden until you leave it and the weeds start popping back up. And we had a lot of that and still have a lot of that in the city. And so part of what we have tried to do is to send signals throughout the first part of this year up until now that really this focus on discipline only, what do we do when a young person transgresses a line, really is after the fact for what we should be doing. And so a lot of our work has been really about promoting healthy school climates. And to do that, what it is required of us is, one, that we actually make an investment in district-wide capacity building amongst all of our schools. And one of the ways that we are doing this is we have committed to restorative practices development and training that has been, I think, headed up by Eric Banzak, who's been doing wonderful work with that. Phil Leaf has supported us in this work for years. But really getting hold and saying, if this is something that we need to do in terms of shifting culture, we have to be able to give frontline professionals in schools the tools that they need, teachers, principals, guidance counselors, those are who I call frontline educators, the skills to be able to do that. And what we found was that it actually is very episodic. It's based on a fabulous principal like Alinda Taylor, right, who gets it and who goes out and understands that this is part of what will help make young people successful. And then in a school district where there's lots of autonomy, it does not now mean autonomy at the school level. It does not now mean that everyone has the tools that they need to be able to do that. So what we have done is said we are getting our resources together, we're prioritizing, and we're offering to schools the opportunity to go deep with restorative practices rather than just kind of having a smattering of here and there throughout the district. The second piece that we did was we identified our 30 to 40 schools, it ended up being about 35 overall, that had the most challenging school climates, the ones that were most, in colloquial terms, off the hook. And what we did with those was we deployed a team of 2 former principals and some additional support staff to actually work and coach on the ground with various school leadership teams around what their overall school climate needed to look like. And what's very interesting, and for a number of folks in this room might not be so surprising, is that what we found is that a lot of what we call the habit loop, a lot of the habits of ways of doing, of ways of talking, systems, interactions between adults and kids, were not defined. They were not clear. Adults, they were rather episodic. And so what the team provided over the course of the mid-fall up until now has been the kind of on-the-ground coaching that takes a great PowerPoint or takes a great kind of lecture hall professional development like this and helps people actually convert it on the ground, helping leaders to think and to see differently their school environments. And what we have found is that a lot of that are just the little things, the way that the front office operates when kids come in. How do we speak to one another? What are the triggers that occur on an everyday basis that, if we look at it from the perspective of having a healthy environment, actually really leads us into more of an asset-based approach to working with young people. So those are areas now that we've spent that time working with those 30 schools. From that work, we are actually really developing a framework. And, you know, in a room of people who may spend a good amount of time in schools and with educators, I dare say a rubric. I fear for my life whenever I say rubric, since everything's got a rubric these days. But at the very least, what we have and what we are developing now is, from that on-the-ground work, really a framework for all schools to be able to say, these are kind of the proactive elements of school culture that we need to be mindful of if we really are going to meet the needs of young people. The other piece that I think is really important, and it ties nicely into a lot of the day that you've spent, is with our focus on literacy, which is our academic focus area. We too have heard from a number of our young people, students in Baltimore City, that their voice, and this gets into healthy climates, that there's no space for their voice within the school culture, within the school environment. And so the ability to have voice, the ability to have agency, is also what we believe will help shift from a deficit-minded approach, right? Everything that is, quote, wrong with kids. And we, too, attend to and are investing in making sure that school leaders and educators do know a lot of the research on trauma and its effect, and we should do that. Thank you. And we should do that. But one of the things we have also felt is incredibly important is that the way that we frame this has to be from an agency perspective, right? In allowing young people who, for so many of them, feel as if so much is out of their control, that so much is kind of pressing in on them environment-wise, to be able to give them voice again, even within the context of one. What does it mean to have a healthy school environment, and what is their role in a healthy school environment? And so what's really interesting is that when we have talked to young people, one of the things that we continue to find is that oftentimes our lack of this space for their voice and our discipline-focused approach has almost been a form of additional trauma. We are re-traumatizing young people who come from traumatic environments. And so the best antidote to that is actually to give them voice and to give them agency. The challenge, though, is how we do that across 183 schools. We have schools that do a great job with that, and we have others, frankly, that are challenged. So the real question for us is, how do we take some of the best practices that are happening in pockets and actually raise them to scale? I tell people frequently, I can go into any urban school district in any city in this country and find a well-run school. And yes, even in Detroit, right? Even in Cleveland, even in Baltimore, we have schools that are welcoming environments. We have educators who know how to do this. The challenge is, and the thing that keeps me up at night, believe it or not, is not even really the legislative challenges that I face. It's this question of scale. It's this question of how do we shift a culture, not just for one school, but for 183 schools, and in a way that actually gives young people who are experiencing their lives through various frames of race and class and experiences back power, and not again have something done to them by people who are outside of them and outside of their experiences. Finally, what I will say in terms of the asset-based piece that we feel is particularly important, and that we hear continually from young people, is that a lot of the triggers in terms of healthy school climates and healthy adult-student relationships is being able to connect school to the outside world more deliberately. That comes from being able to partner, frankly, with youth organizations who in some ways do a better job than we do in connecting with young people. They have an expertise that we as educators have not always grown or fostered. And so one of the things we are doing very deliberately is finding ways to partner more systematically and systemically with youth organizations that have figured out within their special sauce how to actually engage young people in ways that are meaningful. And then finally, and I'll end with this, that what we hear over and over again is that the importance of the connection between young people and the world of work, and in very immediate ways, because frankly, for a lot of them, their immediate needs, and again, if we want to go to the kind of trauma in quotes, some of that trauma is connected to the fact that there is not the economic stability that they need, right? It's not just trauma, because, I tell everybody, kids in the suburbs are traumatized too. The difference is they get therapists and then go back to AP calculus class. When you are traumatized in Baltimore City in certain zip codes and neighborhoods, it means, for example, real story, right, of a young man who didn't have a place to sleep, and so was living in a vacant building, heard noises at night downstairs in the vacant building that worried him, made him scared. He runs to get away and goes out of a window, wounds his arm severely, has no medical assistance, right? Doesn't know where to go, because if you're homeless, right, and you're on your own and you're 17, where do you go for medical care? And really what he said to us is, the only place I knew where I could go was back to school. And so part of our role within the city, within city schools, is thinking about how are we seeing school as the connector for young people to have access to the resources that so often many of those lenses prevent them from having access to. And that's it for me. And am I within my 10? Great, I was trying to roll it up. So thank you very much, and I will turn it over. Great. And am I introducing Julia?
I can do it.
Okay.
So,
all right.
Please join me in welcoming the final speaker, Julia Burdick-Will from the School of Arts and Sciences and School of Education.
Hi. Thanks for being here. The last speaker on the last panel. I have a long day. I'm Julia Burdick-Will. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology in the School of Education here at Hopkins. I am a sociologist by training. I do mostly quantitative work, large big data sets with spatial methods, and using administrative data with open source data and surveys to really understand sort of big patterns of school and neighborhood issues across the whole city. I'm particularly interested in sort of the environmental, the outside of school, or the school climate influences on how kids stay engaged in school and achieve, learn, particularly focused on the influence of violent crime, exposure to neighborhoods with high crime rates, schools that are unsafe and have high crime rates in and of themselves. What I'm going to talk about today is some evidence from Chicago. Until very recently, I was in Chicago getting my PhD. And so what I'm going to talk about today is some of my own dissertation work, but also some other research from others at Chicago, particularly the Consortium on Chicago School Research at the University of Chicago. I'm not going to go into details about any of these particular studies, but I wanted to put the citations up there in case anyone wants to follow up with them. Instead, I'm going to give you an overview of what I think is one of the really core important issues when we're thinking about climate, which is safety. And it's come up all day, but safety and violence and the importance of creating a safe environment for kids, and how there is some role for the schools can control some of this, where you can't necessarily control the violent crime rate in the neighborhood where the kids come from. So I'm going to talk about Chicago. Chicago in many ways it's come up a lot today. Many similarities to Baltimore. It's a large urban district, a lot of open enrollment, although not quite as open as Baltimore. It's a city with serious segregation problems, serious concentrations of disadvantage in specific neighborhoods, as well as sort of depopulation of vacants in a lot of neighborhoods, and really severe violent crime in some places. Given these circumstances, there's been a lot of research growing on the impact of living in a violent neighborhood on these kids, or attending a school with violent crime rates that are really high. There's impacts on kids' concentration, their ability to sort of use that working memory to carry the one in the addition problem, right, to really pay attention to the learning. Impacts on behavior, trust in schools as well. There's some really fascinating work recently published by Anjanette Chan-Tak and Mario Small, qualitative work in Chicago on how elementary school kids are forming strategic friendships in violent neighborhoods, where they're not becoming friends with someone because they have the same interests, but they're becoming friends with someone because they think it will provide some sort of protection, or they're testing kids before they're willing to call them a friend. Really sort of social impacts that really come into the classroom with kids. And all of these factors sort of come in, they reduce kids' abilities to learn on a daily basis in the short term, but also in the long term, lead to disengagement from the schooling process, lower test score growth, lower graduation rates. But there's the exposure to crime, and then there's also the perception of safety. And they're not actually the same thing, right? We've talked a lot about the crime and trauma and witnessing crime, but perceptions of safety are also really important, and they're not quite the same thing. They're related. There's a dynamic process that happens where, you know, high crime rates lead to feeling unsafe. But there are kids, you can feel safe in a place with a high crime rate, and you can feel unsafe in a place where there's actually not all that much crime. But safety is particularly important in schools. Even when things are going on around the school building, or even inside the school building, creating a safe place for kids is really important. Learning doesn't happen without it, as Catherine pointed out. Schools where kids feel safe improve better over time. Kids who feel safe in school learn more by the end of the year. Safety is really sort of a prerequisite for learning. They go in hand in hand. It doesn't happen without it. So what do we know about where kids feel safe, and how we can harness that to sort of improve the safety in some of these schools? Well, my research has shown, looking at Chicago, that there is really wide variation in schools in the safety level and the violent crime level in schools. Schools that are close together in the same neighborhood, sometimes the same block, sometimes even the same building, have dramatically different perceived safety rates and also crime rates on their grounds. And the crime rates tend to fluctuate a lot from year to year. This is reported crime. But perceived safety is relatively more stable. There is some change over time, but it's really something about the environment and the school, not necessarily the number of things that have happened that year. So where do kids tend to feel safe? Unsurprisingly, in schools where there is higher achievement and more advantaged populations, students feel safer. Safety and violence are a really big problem in particularly very low achieving schools. Schools also feel safer when there are lower suspension rates. And this is even after adjusting for differences in achievement and demographics. There's something about high suspension rates that really does seem to be related to students' perceptions of safety. Qualitative research shows that students who feel that the discipline system is arbitrary and capricious feel much less safe. They sort of report saying, you know, they felt like they got in trouble just for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And that just heightens your attention and your awareness and makes you feel unsafe, not only from your students, but also from disciplinarians. But despite all that, the best predictor, at least in Chicago, of where students feel safe comes from the background of the students, where they're coming from, the kinds of neighborhoods that they're coming from. The high poverty and particularly high violent crime neighborhoods, when you have large numbers of kids from those neighborhoods, the whole school tends to feel less safe for everyone. And that is sort of the best predictor, demographically at least, of safety. But even in schools with the same kinds of kids, the same kids from similar backgrounds, even in the same school in different years, there are things that schools can do, things that schools can control that seem to make a really big difference, that are bigger, more important factors than the demographics on their own. One of the things that comes out of the research is the importance of adult supervision. Kids feel safest in their classroom, where they're basically constantly monitored, and least safe right outside the school building, where there tend to not be any adults. And so adult supervision, when done properly and respectfully, and adults can intervene in ways that tamp down the tensions early on, prevent things from escalating, and can keep everyone in the environment feeling safer. Similarly, I mentioned the discipline system. It's really important that kids feel that the discipline system is fair and just. And that doesn't necessarily mean strict or not strict, right? Richard Arum has done work showing that the strictness of a disciplinary system is not necessarily related to how students feel that whether it's fair or not. What fairness comes from understanding the rules, feeling like they're consistently enforced, and really feeling like everyone knows the game and knows what's going to happen, and you're not just going to get in trouble for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But more importantly in all of this is relationships of mutual respect and trust and collaboration between teachers and students, students and parents, students and teachers and parents, and teachers among themselves, right? So schools where teachers collaborate and work together tend to feel like the whole school is their domain, and they can therefore supervise and intervene in all students in the school rather than just focusing on their own classroom. When parents feel welcome in the school, they're more likely to sort of reinforce the school's authority and help students feel that the disciplinary system is fair and just. And overall, all of these sort of climate measures can have a much stronger relationship with safety than the demographics or achievement level of students themselves. So much so that in a school with really disadvantaged populations but really strong relationships, the perceptions of safety are just as high as a school with a much more advantaged population but relatively weak relationships. So I think these findings have given you sort of a broad overview, but I think they're really important to think about when we're thinking about what we can do to improve safety in schools. The first thing I think, and this has come up a lot today, is safety, perception of safety, feeling safe and feeling able to sort of not constantly look over your shoulder and feel like you're constantly under threat is really, really important for kids, for learning, for just mental health, but also importantly for learning and a climate of accountability for schools. Anything that we can say that also has an impact on learning is really important. And it's not only sort of something that comes out of thin air. This is something that schools can do to improve it. They're leaders who create relationships between the teachers, help teachers create trusting relationships with their students, really can change the climate of the school. And in Chicago, there are examples of schools that started with really low safety rates and had leaders who really, principals and others who really took this on as an important aspect of change and really changed the climate, really did create safer schools for kids. And part of that, I think, is that these relationships are self-reinforcing, right? In both a vicious and a virtuous cycle. Safety and crime go hand in hand. When students feel unsafe, they're more likely to be disruptive and cause more violence and make other people feel safe. But the other way is also true, too. Small interventions, asking a kid if they're all right, if they look a little upset, right, can open doors, can crack that veneer, right, and start to build those relationships over time. That will give students their voice, let them talk to each other, let them talk to teachers, and really build that aspect of safety in the school. And I think the other thing to remember is that they're not just dynamics sort of within the same school, but some of my research has shown that when we think of the school environment, we think of the neighborhood around the school as being where the kids come from, but that's not always true, especially in systems of open enrollment. And kids are coming from all sorts of different neighborhoods to go to all sorts of different schools. And so reducing violence in one neighborhood is not just going to improve the lives of the kids in that particular community school, it's going to have sort of knock-on effects throughout the whole district as kids move around all day, influencing each other and their own neighborhoods and schools, and bringing those experiences back and forth every day. And so, you know, we tend to think of ourselves caught in a sort of vicious cycle of not being able to control these things, but I think if we could harness that dynamic relationship to go the other way, I hope. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I just want to remind people that we are taking questions through email, through tweets, and there are index cards in both aisles if you have questions. And thank you all for your presentations. A number of questions that we've gotten have talked about restorative practices, and I know that the school system is involved now in moving towards a restorative justice framework. I wondered if we could start by just telling us a little bit about the process by which the school system is moving in that direction, and how do you operationalize that? What does it look like in a school, and how are kids responding?
It's a great question. It's always about operationalizing it, isn't it? So part of what we have the advantage of is the fact that we have numbers of schools that have been using restorative practices for years, like even prior to this initiative. So what that allows us to do, and we've done it in the past, but we're more deliberately doing now, is actually inviting schools to see what does restorative practices look like in motion. What does it look like in a real school in any given day? So that's one piece. The second piece is asking principals, school teams to actually come up with what their plan is, like what system are they using now to foster part of the healthy environment. And I just want to go on and say that restorative practices in and of itself is not a magic bullet to a healthy school climate. We're starting there because we have a critical base of knowledge from other schools in the district. And so what this does is it allows us, one, as the district, to say this is the approach that we are supporting. If a school has been using another approach and feels as if they meet the criteria for a healthy school environment with that approach, we're not forcing them to throw it out, but more often what we are finding is a larger percentage of schools don't know what to do, right? They're not sure what the next step is, and so restorative practices allows them a way to wade into the water, begin to have tools that help them set up things like, restorative circles. Like, what does that look like to have a practice, to have a routine where young people routinely have voice, routinely practice how they speak with one another, how they reaffirm one another, how they frankly correct and express negative experiences as well. And so, again, part of why we chose restorative practices, we already had some knowledge of it in the district. We have schools that are frankly very adept with restorative practices, and from a very practical standpoint, it allows us as a district to hone in and prioritize one frame. We were funding at the time, when I re-entered the district, 5 or 6 different approaches, and we weren't getting lift in any of them. And what we made the decision to do was to go with one, to be able to go deep and to have greater sharing across schools. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. And we also had some questions about how that framework fits with some of the other things we heard about. So one question was, where restorative practices are serving as a kind of a bridge from Tier 1 PBIS to other more intensive, so Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions, how do you approach the issue of reconciling the focus on external incentives in a lot of PBIS with the focus on internal motivation and communal norm setting in many restorative practices? So I guess both for you, Dr. Bradshaw, how does PBIS fit in with restorative practices? And then Dr. Burdick-Will, if you've seen any evidence of restorative practices making kids feel safer and how that's played out in the research you talked about.
Sure, and I tend to think about restorative practices as being literally a practice that fits within a broader framework, and so it's a strategy that can be used to teach social emotional skills and reinforce those and provide a context for dialogue when there are challenges that occur. But it's really rough to just start talking about bad stuff when it's happening. And so you want to have more of a prevention framework. And I think that's what's so beautiful about the commitment that the city is making to this particular framework, that it's not just something that's going to be outsourced when there's a crisis that happens, but something that you're going to be using in a daily practice within the school setting. And maybe daily is a bit of a stretch, but many of our schools are spending 2 or 3 sessions a week talking about these practices and using them as more of a prevention approach, because what often happens is when there's a crisis or a challenge that occurs in the classroom, there's a tendency of sending this out to somebody else when it actually could be managed and handled collectively by the group. And in many cases, you don't want to just rely on the adults to manage that. You want to think about what are the norms in the classroom and how can we leverage the positive influences of the peer group to collectively say these are the expectations we have in the classroom, and this is the injustice and the harm that's been done through this, and this is how we can restore that. And not only are the students talking about how they're impacted by certain behaviors, but the adults talk about that. And sometimes that shift from the adult always being in control and always managing can be a little challenging for some adults, and to shift into that more of a disclosure type of orientation. As we think about reinforcing behaviors, we want reinforcement all kinds of ways. And some kids do respond to things like tickets or tokens. Other kids really respond a lot to a positive reinforcement from adult that's about you had a good job. You did a great job managing that situation. And so that's why we want to have a lot of tools in our toolkit when we think about different ways that we can reinforce. So I certainly don't think that a reinforcement has to be some kind of extrinsic motivator. In many cases, kids want to do well. They want to be rewarded and recognized for the things that they do. In some situations, some kids need that kind of ticket or that dollar or some kind of way of being recognized. Other kids are more motivated by internals. So that's why we need a lot of different tools in our toolkit. But at the end of the day, it's really about giving strategies to teachers to remind them to have a positive exchange for students. They are really the ones that need reminders because they get so busy with their day and often are so distracted by the negatives, they forget to stop and actually point out the good things that are happening. And so the idea of catch them being good and reinforce the good behavior is really just a reminder for the adults to have that positive exchange. So I don't see those as conflicting in any way. It's just another way of thinking about reinforcing positive behavior and setting in motion certain kind of practices that are modeling positive interactions and creating a context for a challenging situation and reflection that can occur.
So I think I don't have any specific examples, but I think that from what I've read, having a system of any kind is important, right? And thinking about the more that you can take experiences in a school that work and have a system that's set up, students respond to understanding what the rules are going to be, right? The reinforcement works when it's consistent and when it's expected and when you know what the reward or punishment will be for some sort of infraction. And so having a sort of making that as clear as possible to the students and any kind of incentive you can have a reminder for teachers to actually enforce it that way, I think is really helpful. That is what leads to compliance and leads to students not acting out, right, is when they know what's going to happen. And I think the other important thing about a sort of justice approach is the talking and the at least attempt at trust, right, that you have to have. That's really important. And a lot of these kids are coming from they've had social experiences that have led them to be incredibly mistrustful, and to have associates, not friends, as Alex Kotlowitz mentioned earlier, right? And so anything that you can do to sort of bring out that trusting relationship and start to build that social glue, I think will be really important.
We've had a couple of questions also about the role of teachers in this, and all of you referred in your answers to the questions about restorative justice to teachers needing to be consistent in the message, teachers needing to participate, teachers playing a big piece of this. And in many ways, teachers are subject to many of the same stresses that our students are in terms of violence in neighborhoods and the possibility of not taking an asset-based approach, hopefully not too often. But so what is necessary to prepare teachers for these kinds of approaches, and what is the school system doing to address teacher stress, burnout, and turnover in this time of great change?
Well, I will say having a projected budget gap doesn't help in terms of stress. So let me just put that out there. But I do think one of the things, and it's something that Catherine just noted, and it really is about building the toolbox. Like 9 times out of 10, when I talk to a teacher, it is I'm using suspension because that's what I know. Right? I'm putting someone in a corner because that's what I know. And everything has a limit. PBIS has a limit. Restorative practices has a limit, right? Everything has a limit. The question is, how are we building the capacity of teachers to be able to do that? The second piece is a healthy school environment is not just healthy for kids. A healthy school environment is healthy for adults, and there's a reason why when Julia was citing some of her research around the indicators, why, in schools, where it was no surprise to me that schools that have collaborative exchanges amongst educators are more likely to have healthy school environments, because when the adults are healthy, the young people tend to be healthy. And so this is why, I opened with the fact that this is about a culture shift. And we have a very, and I'll say it in this room because I've said it in others, we have a very command and control culture in this city. And it's very much about how can I put my finger on somebody to keep them from doing something they shouldn't be doing. And that I have to own within a system, right, is central office to schools, it's principals to teachers, and it's teachers to young people. So it's shifting a whole culture so that it's not acceptable at every level. We're not just trying to do this for adult-student relationships. We're trying to do this for relationships, period. And I think that's an important, that's an important notation. Stress people, stress other people out. And so, part of it is how do we, and my kids say that to me all the time. They're like, you clearly had a stressed day today. Are you stressed today? Because they feel it. So that's how we've got to be able to work through this. And that, for me, at least from sitting at a district level, I'm very aware that it has to be cascades of healthy environments.
I think in a lot of the programming that we've done, we've been so focused on the kids, we've kind of jumped over the person that delivers a lot of these programs and interventions. But you think when you get on an airplane, they always say, before we take off, we've got to review all these details, including if we lose cabin pressure, you've got to put the oxygen mask on yourself first before you assist somebody else. So if we have teachers that can't breathe and they can't manage the stress, there's no way they're going to be able to respond empathically to a student. There's no way that they're going to be able to respond and develop an authentic relationship with a student or integrate culture into the curriculum, because they're really just trying to get through the day. And so in our own research, we've been collecting data not only on kids, but to try to understand what are these interventions actually doing to adults. And I mentioned briefly the good behavior game. Well, we found that we combined that with the social emotional learning curriculum. Even though we didn't explicitly tell the teachers we wanted to work on their own social emotional learning, we actually had an impact on that just by giving them some tools and strategies to manage their own stress and to teach some of these basic principles, because they never got that in their pre-service learning. And so learning to the impact of their own behavior and the modeling that they were doing about how they managed stress and how they managed emotions and how they expressed it impacted them as well as the students. And so when we think of the adults as just being a pass-through, we're really not investing in the workforce that we want. And the list goes on and on. I have a colleague, Tish Jennings, who does a lot of work in the area of mindfulness. She's very focused on how can we make teachers more mindful of the own stress that they're experiencing, especially when they're trying to teach across lines of difference, thinking about working with a kid that you don't really understand their background or you don't understand their culture. Your back goes up, you get really hostile, you literally, teachers are clenching their fists, and they don't realize that because they haven't gone through that self-reflection process about the stress they're carrying. So no wonder kids are thinking, well, why did she get in my face when she was upset with me because I didn't do this? Teachers aren't even aware of that. So we need to be much more sensitive to the stressors that teachers are facing and give them tools in their toolkit to be able to interact more positively with students.
So the We've only got about 3 more minutes, but the other 2 subjects that have come up in multiple questions are one about community schools, and the Baltimore City adopted a community schools policy last year, and so what role does that play in creating the kinds of cultures that we want for our students, our teachers, and all stakeholders? And then the other is specifically about everything that's going on right now with the budget threat, with school closures, consolidations, different things like that. How does that play into creating a with possible rezoning and closures, how do we create the kinds of cultures that we want for our kids? And I'll just throw that out there for all 3 of you to comment on in any way you'd like.
I'd be very interested in your thoughts on this, to be honest.
I was going to say, which one do you want me to take? You want to take me the first one, or you want to take the second one? So on the first one, in terms of community schools, I think that what I will say on that simply is, to credit the board, they had done a heavy lift on community schools prior to my arrival, and I just happened to be the beneficiary of it. I think what community schools enables us to do is to reestablish lines of respect within, between schools and institutions and the communities we serve. And number 2, I think that respect has to acknowledge that, there are implicit biases that, frame this work. I mean, some of it is the stress of, I've got a heavy job, or, I have a lot of things coming at me. Some of this is implicit bias. I mean, there are ways that we view people that impact whether or not we receive those people and what they have to give. And so I think the beauty of community schools, when done well, and we're hoping we actually see this, is that it breaks down some of those barriers, creates more opportunities for mutual respect. And when people have mutual respect, when you feel like you're respected, you're less likely to get your cat back up. Right? You're more likely, a lot of the reasons why so many of our community members and our families come in ready to get in someone's face is because they're not being addressed in ways that verify their personhood. They're not being verified as having, they don't sit on panels like these, but frankly, a lot of their insights are far more impactful than anything that any of us could say today. So that's one thing I would say. Yes, hear, hear. Secondly, in terms of the budget, it absolutely is stressful, and I think part of what I've sought to do since December is to be able to communicate transparently, to be able to give folks information when we have it. Things are changing rapidly. Like every day there's new information. And so one of the things that I continue to hear is people appreciate the fact that we've been transparent. I'm not in some back room like the Wizard of Oz trying to maneuver levers. I think the positive and the empowering side that has been the absolute upswing of this is what we have seen, what I have seen, what Annapolis has heard, what the entire state has heard, is a community advocating on behalf of itself, its schools, and its young people. And it has been absolutely empowering to watch school staff, to watch families, to watch young people come out and say, our schools matter. We do not want things done to us. We have voice. And frankly, there are a lot of cultures and traditions and histories of people who have not had choices about the stress, frankly, that they live under. I mean, if you've lived under a violent, hegemonic society, you don't have the right to say, I'd really like to turn my head away from lynching, right? Like, you didn't really get that option. What actually empowers you, and I think is one of the best de-stressors, is to be able to advocate for oneself. And so the combination of the mobilization that we have seen in this city, I can't go to the mall anymore without a family stopping me and saying, Dr. Santelises, we believe in our schools, we could have moved, we haven't, we want to fight for our kids, has been absolutely empowering. And that part, while you don't want to have that be the case, I don't get joy out of watching 6-year-olds hold placards that say, please fund our schools. But how empowering that is, to not feel as if someone from far away has control and power over my life, but rather to have 2,000 people mobilizing in one space, to have young people coming out and advocating, and teachers and principals, frankly, has been incredibly empowering. The governor signed today, so just update for those of you who won't watch the news tonight like me. We did get the governor signed the legislation today, and schools came in. School leaders came in and they had 2 budget scenarios, and we were able to say to them, the better of the budget scenario is what you can now budget for. And so they're watching positions being placed back, and it means services will be restored. Not all of them, but certainly not the nuclear doomsday scenario that, frankly, I was looking at back in November. So that's a little update. That's bonus for staying till the end. You get that.
Any last words then?
I defer to her. She did an awesome job. Thank you for taking this job. This is great. Great to have you back.
Thank you both.
Thank you so much for staying till the end, and thank you to our panel. I'm going to turn it over to Bob Blum for the closing.